about we get started?
Sure.
I'd like to welcome everyone to the Department of Curriculum Pedagogy seminar series here. And before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam people. And we just acknowledge that we're on these lands and we appreciate working with them. And today we have this wonderful opportunity to hear from a colleague, Dr. Sam Rocha, who's in the Department of Educational Studies, who's going to be sharing some insights into his new book, The Syllabus as Curriculum, a Reconceptualist Approach. Now, I don't know how many of you know Sam, but he's a truly wonderful colleague to have in the faculty. I've grown to really appreciate working with him. I know that Sam has come to us through working at several universities. And just to give a little bit of a formal background, he completed his MA and his PhD from Ohio State. And his dissertation was an award-winning dissertation, receiving the Lodeman Dissertation Award. And after that, he had a couple stints working at Wabash College in Indiana, and then also at the University of North Dakota, before coming to us in 2014. And since then, he's been assistant and now an associate professor in the Department of Educational Studies. He's known for writing several books, one of which, of course, we're going to be talking about today, but one that I have brought up with some of my students a few times, and that's a Folk Phenomenology, which I really like. And there's also some others that I share with my students. One thing I particularly appreciate about Sam is that he not only has this wonderful scholarly presence in the field and does incredible work in the field, but he's also this musician, and he really practices his musicianship all of the time. I do follow him on Facebook, and I know that he very regularly plays at the Wolf and Hound in Kitsilano. So I do invite people to have, if when you are able to, is to go and have a listen to some of his music. But also he has some recordings. So and I have a feeling today we might be hearing some. So I just know that I've appreciated working with Sam and learning with and from Sam, and certainly from his work on some of the committees that he's on with me. And I thought this would be a wonderful kind of interface with our department, just to learn from him and his recent book on the syllabus as curriculum, a reconceptualist approach. So I'm going to turn it over to Sam now to take us on his journey for today.
Thank you so much, Rita. I'm going to put on my headphones and get my screen up. Okay. I think some of you may be shocked to know that COVID has changed me and that I now have created some visual things to go along with my manuscript, but hopefully they're consistent with my past probably neurotic senses of that kind of stuff. Let's see here. Maybe if even just one person, maybe Rita, if you could just say if you see.
I can see your slides, yes.
Wonderful, thank you. So just a quick warning before I kind of officially start. I'm going to be reading. I'm going to stay on the page. The page got a bit longer than I had expected, and I sort of didn't have probably the time I needed to edit as I should have, but I'm going to stay very close to this, and then I will remove the whole thing at the end, and we'll gather once again for a more casual and less formal discussion and questions and whatnot. The Syllabus as Curriculum and the Poetic Secret of Objects. It is customary to thank one's host at the beginning of an invited lecture. I am, of course, deeply grateful to Rita Irwin for her invitation on behalf of her department's lecture series committee and for her generous introduction here today. However, on this occasion, my gratitude extends beyond custom or formality, important as those things surely are. This is my 7th year at UBC, a Sabbatarian interval interrupted by a global pandemic. As much as I consider it a blessing to count myself amongst my colleagues in the Department of Educational Studies, where I was hired and am appointed, I was also fortunate to forge an early and now strong relationship to EDCP, especially with faculty and students working in curriculum theory, art education, and critical pedagogy. It is an embarrassment of riches. For this reason, my gratitude extends beyond formality and recognizes the unmerited welcome I have enjoyed here, the friendship and conviviality, the grace and, yes, the love. I know one should never speak of love in public. Whatever it is that professionals and professors ought to profess, it is surely not their love, and certainly not their love for one another. But these are uniquely and, dare I say, amorously distanced places, spaces, and times. We gather as an intellectual and academic public mediated by telecommunication. While this may seem to put us at an immense digital distance from one another, socially distant, far from the analog reach of human touch and knowing gaze, it also allows us to hide. And hiding can be a most intimate thing. Our present distance, justified by the most existential of reasons, has brought a new hiddenness into view. We can literally hide behind a muted mic, a disabled camera, a Zoom background, or a shared screen. But what does that mean? What significance does it bear for our lives, together and apart? I do not know. But I can recognize that this is an unknown I have not known before. For example, Hannah Arendt insisted upon a sharp and categorical distinction between the public and the private realm, preserving each for their own sake, with small hints at threshold spaces and places and times. I do wonder how she might analyze the present Zoom gathering. While we meet here in a mediated public space where I have sarcastically suggested that one should not speak of love, most of us also meet here in the most private living spaces of our homes. The risks of indecency are perhaps all too well known by now, but these risks, indecent as they surely are enabled by the condition of this doubled sense of here, both public and private, and not a mere threshold between them. The Arendtian distinctions must, like all distinctions, be reconsidered with reality standing by as a demanding counterfactual. It is precisely for these reasons that it may be permissible and even desirable to speak of love today. But enough about love. Enough for now. More importantly still, or perhaps more appropriately, I must further extend my notes of thanksgiving to confess that this welcome I have received in EDCP from my arrival to UBC, to this lecture, has left a distinct mark upon me, and in turn, the work I bring to share with you today. I was invited to speak about my new book, The Syllabus, as curriculum, a reconceptualist approach. If nothing else remains in your memory from these words, let it simply be my gratitude, acknowledging that this book would surely never have been written, in part or as a whole, without many unearned accidents, including the engagement and friendship of many colleagues and EDCP. In the sections to follow, I will work through my title, The Syllabus as Curriculum and the Poetic Secret of Objects, in a threefold reversed order: of objects, the Poetic Secret, and the Syllabus as Curriculum. I will end with Thanksgiving, a song I wrote 2 years ago, which appears in my 2019 album, Anamnesis. The lyrics of this song also appear in the conclusion chapter of my book entitled Towards a Wounded Curriculum. This musical ending simply repeats my thanks one last time. Of objects. The simplest grammatical sense of the subject and the object is a useful, albeit unoriginal, way to begin to speak of objects. The subject and the object sit on either side of the predicate of a sentence. The subject is the active entity animated by its predicate, whereas the object is the passive entity that receives the subject's attention, or animation, Take this sentence as an example. The dog chased the bicycle. The dog is the subject and the bicycle is the object. That is, the dog is the subject that chases the object, the bicycle. This grammatical sense of the subject and object easily modulate into a different register when we use it to make sense of the harm of objectification. When the subject is torn away from its active predicate and rendered a passive object, we find something much more grave and morally significant than a mere grammatical mistake. If you allow me to modulate the analogy further and fully personify the subject into an ensouled and active person, then at that scale we see that the injurious disorder of objectification is not grammatical at its core. Objectification is not an offense against an abstract set of rules that require an equally abstract subject. More radically still, objectification is a moral offense against the person for whom the language and grammar of the subject serves as a linguistic representation and semantic metaphor. In other words, the harm of objectification is best understood as depersonalization. In every place and time that the person or a people are threatened by an existence that is otherwise than what their personhood is, we must proceed with an absolutely radical caution, far beyond the rigors of grammar or logic. I hope it is not entirely controversial to observe that we are living in a place and time of increasing depersonalization, and the overtly hostile external threats that we know of are not the only ones to account for. The very entities we look to for help and healing are also invariably amongst the guilty who nevertheless are called upon to address and even cure the very injuries they have inflicted. They too must be examined. Indeed, the domain of the personal subject, the self, has shown itself to be a place where depersonalization can exist on the inside and the outside, internally through self-deception and self-loathing, often through the work of memory that immediately calls to mind the educational trauma of learning and knowing. After all, what is the exact difference between remembering, learning, and knowing? Externally, the self is depersonalized through processes of self-formation that are coextensive with the notion of education we find in Bildung, which extends from the province of culture and folk life all the way into institutional and pedagogical spaces like the church, the school, and the university. This scene can be further amplified by tending to the relations that are already present in the grammatical sentence and the harms of objectification and depersonalization. In I and Thou, Martin Buber's analysis of these relations through the I-you and I-it relation demarcate the same lines and trajectories with richer relational complexity and social consequence. More important to this analysis, Buber does not allow the real danger of objectification and depersonalization to tempt, or much less license him to abolish the subject, or in his term, the it. At the end of part 1, Buber proclaims, quote, "And in all the seriousness of truth, hear this, without it, a person cannot live, but he who lives with it alone is not a person." It is absolutely crucial for me to emphasize that my interest in objects is not detached from its grammatical reduction to the simple sentence, like the dog chased a bicycle, nor is it cavalier about the moral and existential dangers of objectification and depersonalization. Inspired by Buber's dual sense of the importance of the object to the subject, and also the danger of the subject's alienation by the very same object, the same it, I would like to briefly explore the intellectual history of objects for the sake of amplifying and perhaps even correcting certain accounts of objects that strike me as eligible impostors for the sense of objects I have in mind when I allude to their poetic secret and also to the Syllabus' curriculum as a theory of pedagogical objects. One of my reasons for lightly tracing the history of the philosophy of objects is to correct a rather overdetermined tendency of understanding objects as physical objects like rocks or bicycles. As we will see in more detail, this conflation of the object with the percept shackles the concept of objects into a rather unimaginative and ultimately literalist empirical world. Having cleared my way into my particular and even subjective concern for objects, I suppose I would like to clear this path a bit more to also begin to reveal what I will soon refer to as the poetic secret of objects, which in turn will bring us to the syllabus as curriculum. There are 3 accounts of objects that heavily influence my thinking. These theories of objects all happen to emerge from students of the same teacher, Franz Brentano, in the dusk of the 19th century. It is well beyond the scope of these remarks and of my historical knowledge to speculate on this common root, this common teacher, but it seems worth mentioning all the same. The most obvious debts to Brentano's thought are in Edmund Husserl's sense of the object at the founding of the tradition of phenomenology. Husserl credited the psychological core of phenomenology to a simple Aristotelian insight expressed by Brentano in one word: intentionality. This insight noted that consciousness is always object-directed. Intentionality then can be understood as the orientation of consciousness towards objects. In other words, while many wrongly emphasize phenomenology as pertaining to the subjective domain of experience, we can plainly see that it is more obviously a theory of the object-directedness of our subjectivity. The need to attend to lived experience is not for its own sake. It is not sui generis. Rather, it is because of its fundamental orientation towards real objects. After all, the study of phenomena, or appearances, phenomenology, is only possible because of this orientation towards objects. For this reason, Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology, inaugurated in 2002 in Tool Being, Heidegger and the Metaphysics of Objects, which spurred many novelty movements like speculative realism and new materialism, was never presented as a new idea about objects, other than to focus on the peculiar withdrawal of Tool Being and Martin Heidegger's account of objects. It is a new reading, to be sure, not a new idea. Harman and Heidegger work within the Husserlian phenomenological tradition that seeks the things themselves, which, as things, are also the magnetic stuff that our consciousness requires for its own constitution. If you recall the simple analogy to grammar, the subjective phenomenon of consciousness is thrown by its predicate towards an object. This is the phenomenological theory of objects we find in Husserl's notion of intentionality. In Elisis Meinong's 1904 theory of objects, the metaphysics of objects is simpler because Meinong does not initially take into account the subjective element of consciousness, although he does raise this as his essay moves along. His initial theory results in a fourfold account of objects: objects that exist, objects that subsist, objects that do not exist, and objects that do not subsist. At the heart of Meinong's distinction between existence and subsistence is the same basic division that William James made between percept and concept. James, in turn, was surely influenced by Charles Sanders Peirce's metaphysics that distinguished the real from the existent, making room for objects like non-real existence. Meinong's theory of objects develops this fourfold taxonomy of objects and admits that all four possess a kind of quasi-being, which subjective and psychological consideration adds further complexity, for which he calls for a new science of objects. What is crucial about Meinong's account of objects is the clarification that the word object does not refer to a bicycle. In other words, a concern for objects does not entail an explicit or even partial concern for physical or empirical objects or corporeal bodies. The notion of the object, while realist in orientation, does not abandon the idealist principle that ideas and notions and even outright fiction can be treated as absolutely real and consequential. An easy reminder of this sense of objects is the proliferation of mathematical objects, purely abstract notions, within the physical sciences. A better, but far more difficult reminder is, as we will see, the enigmatic aporias we find in the objects of art. The third student of Brentano is Sigmund Freud. While the now signature Latinate Freudian terms ego and id have taken on a rather technical meaning, we can find Freud's sense of objects in the original German expressions ich and es. In striking similarity to the aforementioned Buber, we see that Freud's ich is the I, and his es is more literally translated as the it. At a basic, simplified view of Freud's descriptive account of psychology, ignoring for the moment the more properly psychoanalytic element of the unconscious, is the I-it distinction, a basic subject-object division that, again, recalls the basic grammar of language, which Freud's student, Jacques Lacan, would claim to possess the full significance of Freud's theory. What I find most significant in Freud is that the basic psychological apparatus and the characteristic traits of objects remain the same. While phenomenology, analytic metaphysics, and psychoanalysis diverge in numerous ways, they all possess a roughly consistent understanding of objects at their core. While this stability is significant to me, I must admit a great deal of frustration with accounts of phenomenology that ignore objects and theories desperate for newness. That ignore objects and theories desperate for newness that claim to have discovered objects ex nihilo, only to later reveal that they are generally anchored in a physicalist and literalist empirical understanding of objects, which betrays the philosophical subtlety of objects and their tense but essential relation to the subject. Above all, I fundamentally reject any wholesale divisions between theoretically trademarked objects and subjects. It makes for wretched grammar and equally wretched and overdetermined ideas. Forgive me for airing so many grievances. Let me assure you that these allergic reactions are not what drew me to phenomenology or what sustained me as a phenomenologist. What I have grown to love about phenomenology are its many inflections, including the variety present within a single person's thought, like the early and late Husserl. It is like jazz to me. It can swing and groove and go totally anarchically free. It has realist ballads and idealist incantations. There is room for the subject, the object, and the predicate. What excites me most about objects is not their intellectual history. What I find fascinating about objects, using the term in the sense I have tried to convey here, is their poetic secret. A secret hidden in plain sight, and the enormous pedagogical difficulties and complexities that emerge from that secret and lead us into a key thematic principle, but also a profound problem in my book, The Syllabus as Curriculum. The Poetic Secret. If we personify what I have called the poetic secret of objects and ask who is the poetic secret of objects instead of what is the poetic secret of objects, we may arrive at the obvious but superficial secret more directly, but also more carefully. Who is the poetic secret of objects? Let us call them poesis, the name in Greek that means to make. This answer is deceptive because while poesis discloses the secret that objects must be made in the same way that the subject, animated by the predicate, acts upon the object, it doesn't immediately reveal that the poetic secret of objects conceals another secret, a close relative, or perhaps a neighbor, or is it a twin, named praxis. It is only when we consider both the obvious yet superficial meaning of poesis, that is, that objects are made, composed, and constituted by subjects, that every subject is poetic in the sense that they make objects, alongside the omitted possible twin, praxis, that we begin to appreciate the poetic secret of objects. Most contemporary educational theory either uses praxis in a Hegelian and Marxist dialectical sense, or simply distinguishes praxis from theory as practice. And these usages carry good reasons and many valid justifications. However, in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, we find a tripartite division between theoria, poesis, and praxis in Book 6, where he considers forms of activity and intelligence. We might call this the Aristotelian theory of multiple intelligences, albeit one quite different from Howard Gardner's debunked neuromyth theory that he has personally retracted, and that the entire field of educational psychology has dismantled for over 20 years, and which nonetheless can be found in global teacher education curricula ad nauseum. Forgive my outburst. I'm simply dumbfounded at how this nonsense endures, since it is as credible as flat earth or terrain theories or climate change denial. Okay, back to my point. In equivalent English terms, Aristotle distinguishes thinking, making, and doing. For the sake of simplicity and brevity, I want to focus on the distinction and relation between making and doing, poesis and praxis. There is no time for theory. The key difference for Aristotle's distinction between making and doing is that each activity and sense of intelligence has a different telos, or end. It is notable that what some people dismiss as teleological thinking can have multiple and distinct expressions well beyond thought. In fact, even the telos of bringing an end to teleological thinking, ending ends, has its own anti-teleological teleology. We should never be fooled by these sloppy and elementary mistakes posing as insight, no matter what noble ends they may serve. For Aristotle, making has the object as its end. When I make something, the thing I am making is my end. When I complete the thing I am making, I have ended my making. My making is now complete. Poesis, then, is instrumentally attached to the production of its object. Praxis, on the other hand, has an altogether different teleology for Aristotle. Doing is always for its own sake. When I do something, the thing I am doing is what I am doing it for. This radical shift in teleology from a productive teleology of making to a teleology of activity for its own sake contains the poetic secret of objects and the deeper mystery that shows that this secret is not self-sufficient or self-contained. The secret has secrets. Otherwise, the productive and constructive teleology of poesis would result in little more than some garden variety form of constructivism. There is perhaps another secret of objects to mention. Better yet, there may be another way to reiterate this secret. Aristotle also noted that metaphysics begins in poesis, which amounts to little more than saying things can come to exist through their making, or things come to exist through their making. In my 2015 book, Folk Phenomenology, I have adapted this simple insight into the claim that art precedes metaphysics. What I meant was not entirely different from Aristotle's statement. However, I also have my doubts about the phenomenological durability of Aristotle's distinction between making and doing in the face of the simple difference between the luthier who builds and repairs guitars and the guitarist who plays guitar. I can see the basic sketch. I can recognize the teleological variety. But I must admit that I oscillate between a number of unconvincing ideas about it. And just like that, the poetic secret of objects withdraws once again. Let us now finally approach some educational questions that bring us closer to the role of objects, both their productive, poetic role, but also their insufficiencies and mysteries. Within my book's attempt to present a critical yet faithful account of curriculum through the object of the syllabus in the spirit of the Reconceptualist tradition in curriculum studies. It is common, albeit not common enough, to think of the object of teaching as a subjective art. In the more direct case where the teacher is teaching the plastic or fine arts, there seems to be even more reason to take this artistic conception of teaching at its word. At the same time, immediate complications jump out here and prevent much, if any, conceptual development. There are modern theories of art, for instance, that seek to detach art from its teleological baggage, to rewire the classical productive teleology of poesis into a practical activity for its own sake. These aesthetic conversations share critical territory with conceptions of teaching that are more practical, even as they turn to poesis as their ally against instrumentalism. From these admittedly loose associations, two immediate conclusions emerge. The first is that you cannot have both. If teaching is an art, then it follows to accept the teleological baggage that poesis carries and drop praxis off somewhere else. This is highly unsatisfying, to put it mildly. After all, things can not only have different ends, they can also have multiple different ends. I can accomplish the sequential end of this lecture and feel like it ended in failure. Two different and simultaneous ends. A dancer can execute their poetic objects of movement with their skilled and trained body and nonetheless feel no subjective motivation for the technical objects as their end. Maybe Aristotle's just wrong here. Maybe he should have danced. To be clear, I don't really care if Aristotle is right or wrong about thinking, making, and doing. I cannot read Attic Greek, and even if I could, all we have of his ideas are class notes and fragments and 2.5 millennia of people much smarter than me applying his ideas to numerous issues and problems, internally and externally. For that matter, I don't particularly think that the aforementioned Germans understood objects perfectly either, nor do I believe I'm in any position to correct them. What I am concerned with is how their ideas, when studied in some detail and treated with detached integrity and rigor, all more or less result in a vaguely shared sense that objects are really important. Contrasting this metaphysical and poetic concern for objects from the overwhelming concern for the modern subject in contemporary education, from subjects as persons, teachers and students, to the subject matter of content and curriculum, and of course the rebellious reconceptualist insistence that the curriculum cannot be reduced to the content and methods, including the dreaded syllabus of Ralph Tyler. Caught in this concern for objects, above all the object of art, and my overarching realist sense of phenomenology as being object-oriented, and the contrasting concern for subjects, above all the moral concern for persons and their social relations, I found and continue to find myself in a state of deep confusion. The teacher candidate often thinks of praxis in the basic sense of activity for its own sake, as the zone where they can really make themselves into a teacher, or at the very least the kind of apprenticeship model that would serve them better than any classroom-based alternatives. They seem to long to be out of the classroom in order to find a way to spend their career in one. On the other hand, the educational foundations have long argued that the poetics of academic study can produce more durable and rewarding ends for the aspiring teacher. And we have the echoing refrain from Plato to Jacques Rancière that there is no teacher but the inner teacher. This refrain seems to favor the teacher candidate's opinion. But the texts with these lessons are often only to be found in the classroom of the foundation's teacher, if they are to be found at all. And what do we make of their teaching of teachers? Let me confess more directly. What do I make of my own teaching? That was my real question. With so many competing ideas I can barely keep straight in my head, plus the way terms change and morph, plus the demand to communicate with some intelligibility, and above all, the insistence to have some shred of fidelity to ethical concerns and moral desires, all while confessing that I do not know what teaching, education, pedagogy, curriculum, learning, study, schools, or the syllabus are exactly. I only have a few ideas and notions, but I've mostly just hoarded and accumulated a few tools and skills. And I have many feelings and emotions and passions. And this vocational maelstrom, the bulk sum of these questions, aimed directly at myself as a teacher educator and professor of philosophy of education and educational theory, the simple, internally voiced, what do I make of my own teaching, led me to try and respond to that question through my own syllabi, seeking to further understand the conceptual form of the object of the syllabus in general as a way to find my way back again to that path of questions of curriculum that I could not ignore internally without ignoring the external traditions and communities of inquiry like EDCP, where those questions are alive and in circulation. Admittedly, this is not a very impressive arrival to the syllabus as curriculum. But I do hope, you now see that this poetic secret of objects is not the kind of secret, like a secret ingredient, that makes everything taste good. It is not salt. I am not a master who can share their secrets. I am a fool who has been foolish enough to mistake routinely rotating windmills as philosophical foes and ride in to do battle and realize painfully that something went horribly wrong, but I remain obstinate that I had some good reason to go to war with the giants, with my pen as my lance. The superficial obviousness of the poetic secret of objects is no longer so obvious, even to the one who wrote an entire book about it and has been invited to give this scholarly talk. The poetic secret of objects is so hidden in plain sight that I have tried to add to its mystery to attempt to find its essence, like adding water to deglaze a pan, but the sauce broke. I suspect that objects are like blurry days, where the only clearly exposed photograph must be blurry or betray its object. This does not mean that there is no such thing as this secret, nor does it mean that the metaphor of a secret is the only option for our understanding. For now, the poetic secret of objects remains a secret, like the beloved remains a mystery to the lover. Syllabus as curriculum. When the teacher makes something for their teaching, they are engaged in a difficult, yet nonetheless poetic activity. And the thing that they make is the object of their making. There is a basic relation between the teacher as subject, the poetic act of making as predicate, and the end result as the object. When we think of the making of a life, or the making of a future teacher or a person, the same basic relation exists, however difficult it is to compare to more concrete activities. When the teacher teaches their student, we might say that they do not make their student as they make their object of teaching, and this caution is important. We should never allow a person to be made into an object too easily. There is a necessary resistance and tension between the subject and the object. Even on the wrong side of the predicate, the object can push back in some degree. Even grammar must be resisted. All the same, we also know that the teacher has the remarkable capacity to make their students into objects or subjects of different degrees of moral quality. I find this reality of teaching absolutely terrifying. I know all too well that the poetics of influence and imitation and aspiration are the albatross of teaching, because I have seen its operation through study and, I admit, through my own teaching. The teacher must, it seems, guard and embrace in different degrees and for different reasons their poetic responsibility as subjects who make objects of instruction, and through those objects play a role in their students' making of their own lives too. At the concrete level of making objects for teaching, the most frequent object I have made, or I make, is a syllabus. This object includes letters and emails and memoranda, syllabus as correspondence, and essays, manifestos, treatises, and covenants, syllabus as essay, and finally, outlines, assignments, and rubrics, syllabus as outline. The first syllabi are amorous in the sense that they speak in the voice of the person to another person. Heart speaks to heart. In other words, The syllabus as correspondence is about speaking with love through the medium of the syllabus object. The syllabus as essay is about art in the poetic sense of making, but also the more specific sense of the medium of writing that the essay demands. Whereas the first syllabus asks the teacher to be a lover subject, the second syllabus asks them to be an author subject. The third syllabus as outline is about order in the sense that shows responsibility and hospitality. This syllabus asks the teacher to take responsibility and show something perhaps less grand than love and less artistic than an essay, a moral and pedagogical concern for basic order. Together, these senses of the syllabus demand 3 different subjective modes from the teacher, and in this way, we see that just as a theory of curriculum can emerge from a primary concern for the subjective life of the teacher, so too can a focus on the object that is the fruit of the teacher's poetic hand result in a theory of curriculum. I see no significant quarrels between these two approaches, so long as they remain honest and willing to accept one essential condition of both the field of curriculum theory and the study of curriculum. The justification for this condition is well beyond the scope of today's lecture, but it has served as its vehicle. When I mount my Rocinante, a horse I surely romanticize and overestimate, I am actually just acting out a scene in a book. Or am I writing the scene in a book? I am neither Don Quixote de la Mancha nor Miguel de Cervantes, but I do know that my one essential condition is probably madness and fiction by the hand of a bitter poet with no pedigree or great name. For these tenuous reasons, the syllabus as curriculum is ultimately about the subject. Not the object. It is my personal testimony and confession to my confusion and doubt, but it is also my subjective conviction that the objects of the humanities and the arts are poetic tools that carry secrets and magic and offer healing, not because they are strong and mighty and grand, but precisely because they are small and weak, vanishing in the spirit. Healed me by opening the wound, opening the wound, opening the wound. You freed me by forcing me to bloom, forcing me to bloom, forcing me to bloom. by going into hell. Going into hell. Going into hell. You amazed me by a thread that is so frail, a thread that is so frail, a thread that is so frail. And I want to thank you for this night. Thank you for the light as the moon reflects the sun. And you know the desires of my heart. The whole longs for the part. The ocean for the brook. You seized me and healed me from the gun. Healed me from the gun. Healed me from the gun. You chased me and freed my soul to run. Freed my soul to run. Freed my soul to run. You pierced me and saved me from within. Save me from within. Save me from within. You bless me and amaze me as my kin. Amaze me as my kin. Amaze me as my kin. And I want to thank you for this day. Even though it's hard to pray, the sun is far too bright. And you know my feet are made of clay, but still you choose to stay. Still you choose to stay. You healed me by opening the womb. Opening.
Oh my goodness, Sam. Oh, that was so incredibly beautiful.
Thank you so much, everyone.
I don't know about others, but I am just I am really taken in by just how incredibly beautiful that was and how thought-provoking it was. I just have a couple remarks before I'll open it up to the
Sure,
floor.
please. Yeah.
See how there's a few comments.
Yes, thank you all so much in the chat.
I was just thinking to myself how wonderful it is to hear language, like even how you opened was talking about love and how we don't hear that in the academy. And then as your presentation went on, how we kept hearing about ideas that we don't often hear about the poetic tools and how the heart speaks to the heart and secrets and magic and these kinds of things. I think what you've opened up for us today is that there's such an aesthetic interface with all that we do, and that we need to spend some time to dwell in those spaces, to experience those. You have certainly given a lot of thought to how we can understand the syllabus, but also everything that we do in education. I couldn't help but I found myself today as I was watching the script come across the screen.
Yeah.
As thinking of it as an object.
Yes.
Also a very poetic and meditative almost as it kept moving by. And yet I found myself not necessarily interested in reading it, but just kind of allowing it to pass and to see that kind of beautiful script pass. And because your voice is so melodic, I was very mesmerized by the voice itself. So what a performance. Well, this is the performance of curriculum. I don't know if anyone has any particular questions to ask you, but we have some people who are I can just see here that Tony Edwards has asked us a question here. I don't know if you can read it or if you want me to read it to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to read it. So can everyone see it there in the chat? There. Here, I'm just going to take this thing off of my neck. It's a little bit, I should have adjusted my ergonomic setup here. Okay. So yeah, the question of horizon in terms of object and subject, yeah, it's of course a major theme in phenomenology, and one that I think is one that I'm interested in maybe just one dimension that I'll name here. So one of the aspects of Husserl that I'm drawn to, and that I'm sometimes even criticized for being a bit dogmatic about, is Husserl's very methodological orientation to phenomenology. His insistence that's essentially, to put it in very blunt terms, if you're not into doing reduction, you're not doing phenomenology. That's sort of Husserl's basic stance on the matter. And the reason that's important is because since Husserl's what you might call first reduction into precisely this object, phenomenology has in some sense pushed the methodological horizon of the object further and further. So I tend to work across what I call the three reductions. So we have this first reduction into the object, which I focused on here, but then Heidegger talks about how, like, well, look, objects don't sort of, just pop up. There's a set of ontological conditions for the emergence of objects, and so Heidegger, I think, in many ways contributed to the methodological expansion of our horizon of phenomenology. And then in the 1990s, there was a movement very heavily influenced by postmodernism, by Derrida and others, that saw this pushing of even the horizon of being becoming called into question by people like Jean-Luc Marion, who are called the Theological Turn. And essentially, to put it just bluntly, the question became, can we talk about God now? Now, this is a sort of a funny question because people like Levinas and many others prior to the 1990s had essentially been doing that very thing. But methodologically speaking, they often did it by disavowing the methodological tradition. Whereas in this case, in the 90s, we saw the openness to a methodological horizon expansion, you could say, from the object to the ontological condition of the object to givenness. In my own thought, I belong, I would say, to the Husserlian methodological line, but also to the theological school of phenomenology, in the sense that I'm open to as wide a horizon and as deep, as high a horizon as we want to imagine. But I want to keep it inside of the kind of methodological framing. And all that to say that one of the very small notes I've made in my work has been to gesture towards one more tiny expansion of this methodological horizon, namely that the gift, le don in French, of Marion, on which he kind of affixes his orientation to phenomenology, that there's this tiny interval between the offering, what it means to offer, and the gift, what it means to give. In his earlier work, I thought he was a bit too juridical about the gift and givenness. And so I wanted to kind of relax that almost legalistic sounding attachment he had to it. And so I presented my idea of the offering in folk phenomenology. What's funny about all this, and in some sense ironic given your question, is that the Syllabus's curriculum has been an opportunity for me to kind of go back to the beginning and go all the way back to the object and wonder whether instead of constantly running away as a kind of method of horizon expanding from that initial object-oriented intentional conception of phenomenology, if there's maybe a secret to objects that was always there. And one of the things I really love reading phenomenologists is we're not very good at citation, and we do a lot of work through illusions, and we subtweet, as we call it, each other and all this stuff like that. But one of the really cool things I love about reading the so-called expansions of the horizon is that when I go back to Husserl, I find all that language in Husserl. And it's really always kind of funny to me how it's not obvious or clear that this horizon movement is a progressive project, or whether in some sense it's actually a radically, you might say in the Arendtian sense, conservative project of returning to and expanding the things that we already have. So I don't know very much about the field usage of horizon in your case, but that's one example within my own work of how I work within the kind of methodological orientation of this tradition to horizon. So thank you. Oh, sorry, I left out the whole education part. So the radical thing about the offering, sorry, the radical thing about the offering, to me at least, is that I can walk into a classroom filled with teacher candidates, and I can point out that there's a serious and severe distinction between what it means to give knowledge or instruction or what have you, and what it means to offer. And this tiny interval that kind of humbles the teacher from giving to offering, I think has made a significant difference in at least my ability to communicate what it is that I'm trying to talk about it, and ultimately trying to do as a teacher. But yeah, sorry, I left that really important part out. Thank you for all the wonderful comments. That was, yeah, I really appreciate all that. Jed, our photographer.
Well, you were right. I was very surprised.
Let everyone know, Jed was taking photos very, very recently in a very responsible, COVID-appropriate way, and sent me this download of things. And I was in the midst of writing this lecture, and so it kind of like, you know, just kind of came together just like that. So go ahead, Jed, sorry.
It has the effect of, for me, of having an added layer, because I was going to say all those photos come with specific smells and memories. So it was almost like you were speaking to lectures at me, or like a lot of what you were saying ended up getting filtered through, because I started thinking like, is he saying? But I'm like, no, he wasn't there. See, like, but and then I was thinking about the conversation we had about iconoclastic writers,
Mm-hmm.
which is sort of like, that's sort of the irony. Like, I'm reading all this iconoclastic literature about smashing, but I'm also like making these images, and the idea of appearance, this frozen object. I don't really know. I think there's sort of another way of, because as you said, it's not normal for you to use projectors, but we're all forced into this in this mode. Even if we use nothing, we're still like, now we're just ahead. So the choice to replace your face with screens or images is interesting. And I just thank you for doing that. That was cool, and I'm honored to be a part of the presentation. But I'm also interested in that. If I would, the choice, and I will speak to the one image of the cat is probably the strongest memory, because it was taken in the heart of the lockdown, and I hadn't seen anybody really for a few days, and then we're allowed to touch cats. This cat came out about midnight on a summer night, and just really was wanting to be pet. And then, of course, as cats are, after about 15 minutes, because it was watching the darkness, and then after about 15 minutes, it had enough, and it left, and I just wanted to go my way. It went on its way, and I was listening to music, and it was just a very visceral moment, especially during the lockdown, of like a life coming out and wanting to be touched. And so when that image came up, it's like, oh yeah, like I was just like very interested in that. And I think it kind of connects this like, educational moment maybe between a cat and me. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. That was good.
No, I appreciate that. One note, if I can, about the moving images. I didn't want to be cute about it, and I wanted to be serious. But in all seriousness, kind of off the record, I consider that a film or a moving picture, because it was a picture that I moved. Moving pictures usually move horizontally, or through these we have this very kind of horizontal plane of movement on our kind of cinematic orientation. But it seems to me just equally as plausible to have a vertical movement, which scrolling kind of changes my relation, at least, to text in a way, where I think something about the cinematic movement of the horizontal line is very much like the traditional book, whereas the scrolling screen creates this kind of vertical fixed point. But for me, the fact that I was moving it with my mouse while trying to play guitar and keep my pedals below, moving around and reading, I conceived of that image as a moving picture, and in that sense, as essentially shooting a film, right? That I was doing the narration that then will kind of affix to it and stuff like that. And given that it's being recorded, I think I'm within my rights to say something like that, given that it will be then shown in some sense through this recorded medium. So I had a lot of thoughts about that. And at one point, I realized that if I went into the sort of more craft-oriented discussion of all of the kind of artistic choices, I would just squash the whole the content. And so I left all of that unsaid. I also developed a bit, though, of a really heavy irritation to methodological demands that we talk ad nauseum about how we did things, because there was something really irritating about even this sort of itch or desire to tell you all the things that went in, as if those could account for it all, like, or as if I'm able to tell you, right? I mean, it just struck me as a conceit, and I got really kind of pissed off about it, and I had to kind of walk away and come back to it later. But yeah, overall though, Jed, the images, I went for one image because I wanted to show an image of my pedal board, because I'm using my pedal board underneath my desk right now, and it was a fairly literal and not very artistic choice there. But as I looked at some of the different photos you took of the pedal board, I realized that there was a lot of depth here, and then I went to your account and realized there was so much there. And so I just kind of did the thing where I just scroll until something just stops my scrolling, and then I just downloaded it and took it. And I think pretty much everything I took made it with a couple exceptions.
It's the scrolling is that is interesting as a movie because of so much of the internet is based around scrolling now.
Yeah.
We all
Yeah.
watch movies on Instagram.
Yeah. I'm resisting the theological
scroll
possibility, of the horizontal versus vertical things. I don't want to ascribe too much meaning there because, to be honest, I didn't think about it until afterwards, so I'd be lying to say. Anyway, Karen, I see your blue hand.
Hello, that was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. I was excited about this opening of syllabus. Particularly for me, I've come to the end of my teaching career just in another few weeks of teaching. And for me, the syllabus has always been my project. It becomes, when I know that I'm teaching a course, even if it's already named something that somebody else has taught, or it's one of those courses, it becomes a project. And as much a project as writing an article, an essay, a poem, or composing something. And it's as a teacher, I think, as a dreamer and as a writer, I put so much time into a syllabus, knowing also that it will emerge because I haven't perhaps met my students yet, or something, that I know that it's holding something as a project that will move forward. And it was kind of interesting because we don't talk so much about the syllabus. And for me, it's the beginning, but I put so much into my idea coming forward of what this is about in that way. And when I saw, your title and certainly the title of the book, I became really excited of the making and the poetics and so forth. And it gave a lot of resonance to me, even as in sort of an ending a teaching career, of an acknowledgement of, for many of us as teachers, think about what's going to be coming ahead, and this project that we have with students and with the things that we bring with it, the things that we choose for reading and for discussions and times. And so I really appreciate this opening and acknowledgement and thinking through this notion of syllabus for all of us in this department, but in others as well. So thank you for the poetics, and what a beautiful presentation as well, which is always so much more fun when we have that aesthetic. So just thank you. That's not really a question, just a comment.
No, I really appreciate that. It's really kind. And I guess the only thing I wanted to mention is that the book is also illustrated by a philosopher of education who I'm a huge fan of, Sasha Sidork, and there's a long story behind his illustrations that I won't go into. But he's not only the illustrator, but he's the founder of a journal when he was a dean at Rhode Island University, or University of Rhode Island, called Syllabus. And I recall him writing to me, asking me to be on the board whenever he founded it. And his introduction to that first issue is, maybe like 7 paragraphs long, but I just think it's phenomenal. And there's a lot of people to credit with the sort of the origins. There's a lot of different origin stories for this book. And today I've focused on the one related to EDCP as my host, but there's a few other ones out there, and they're really exciting, and they're all in the book. Okay, I think I see. Okay, Samia, yes.
Hi, Sam. Thank you so much for that. It was really refreshing to see syllabus conceptualized in this way. And I was trying to connect it with what I know in science education, which is a challenge. But I kept on thinking about Micheline Chee's work, who's a physics educator, and she talks a little bit about having these ontological shifts and how powerful it can be for children and for students. And her she sort of looks at it in terms of science concepts, but in terms of entities, processes, and states. For example, one concept that we grapple with a lot in science is heat. And it's normally thought of as a thing, as an entity, but indeed it's a process. And so I look at your syllabus as poetic, as fitting into sort of this process ontology, maybe perhaps in an entity. And then yet again, I'm sort of, I started to see the syllabus almost like a contract, and you see the legalistic terminology being used in the academy more than a poetic, or maybe it's a legal poetic. I don't really know, because they have their own poetics, the law. So for example, if you want to change your syllabus after the withdraw date, there is a series of legal sounding steps that one must take in order to reconceptualize your syllabus. Or if you want to give an alternative assignment, there are challenges that could be placed forward to giving an alternative assignment after a particular date. So I wondered if you could comment a little bit around this idea perhaps of ontological shifts in the legal pull that we might see in terms of framing the syllabus.
Sure. I mean, the first thing I think of is I would be super curious about how a teacher of law conceives of their syllabus, right? That would be a cool kind of shop talk to have with a legal scholar. I have to say, I have a strong affection for the out of hand dismissal of contract, but I found that as I wrote the book, if I wanted to have any conceptual integrity, I needed to keep myself open to contractile type things. In fact, I've even used the language of covenant, which is one of the most ancient forms of contract that I know of, in one particular syllabus, mainly because I had students who I think were scared by my syllabus. So I tried to reassure them by saying, these are my duties. So it was a kind of weird sort of self-facing contract of sorts. But, you know, I also did a good reading of contracts, and I completely found them super interesting, right? There are clearly better and worse contracts, and there are clearly there's a language, especially I think in the within law, that has a kind of set of shorthand for it and stuff. So I would actually say, instead of trying to necessarily resist, although I have a lot of sympathy for that resistance, the sort of contractile ontology, if you want to call it that, of the syllabus, I would say let's try and make really good contracts, right? Let's try to think about the contract and understand its concept, and understand its use, both ordinary use and also its conceptual principles and what have you. That I can't say that I have any examples in the book that speak to this as directly, but I do try to make room for instance, the memorandum. I found the genre of memoranda to be really kind of this beautiful thing that has existed for a long time, and it can be everything from notes to text messages to emails to official memoranda with insignia and all this stuff. And I got totally, you know, like on every one of these genres, I just tried to see as much as I could. And so, to me, the great the thing I enjoyed about the project is that everything that I wanted to out of hand dismiss, I found that there were examples of people in their poetic hand making something that was worthwhile. And so it forced me to not hopefully close the door too forcefully on anything. Just on your point on science, just because this memory occurred to me, and that I know I see another blue hand. One of the most influential parts of my education was anatomy and physiology and biology and chemistry labs. And I had the same teacher each time, because I went to this little high school where we had one advanced science teacher, and I took all of the science classes. And one of the things I loved about our labs is that, especially with me, I think it was clear that I was sort of not going to become a scientist, probably. That he required me to be thorough on the sort of data collection and reporting. But when I got to that final section on conclusions, he really set me free, and he really let me, I mean, probably put a lot of high school nonsense into those boxes. But nonetheless, he really affirmed the act of making conclusions based on data that don't necessarily speak to an interest in the data itself, but speaks to analogical or associative interest in the data. And I have to say that Mr. Popno is his name. This is probably one of the earliest modes of serious analogical and associative pedagogy that I was exposed to, with all the rigors of the names and the microscopes and all that kind of stuff, on top of it. And so, I have a lot of hope for the science applications here, at least anecdotally speaking, so to speak.
Absolutely. And analogy is one of our most powerful strategies. So thank you for raising that.
Yeah. I mean, for philosophers, pretty much it's all analogy or syllogism, right? It's either working from premises or working on associations and bouncing them between each other. So there's not a whole lot else to talk about. Is there another? I saw another blue hand and then I lost it. Samson.
Thanks, Sam. It's been a very wonderful presentation, very enlightening. Now, I just have one question, and especially it's building on what you are discussing with Samia about the syllabus and the contract. It's very interesting, and as Samia pointed out, sometimes you find you get caught up in what is it we really want to teach. Who are we actually addressing, the students or the other? Who is our superior? Who wants that? But I'm looking at considering your presentation, the text you presented and your voice. If you didn't read it, that was the one reading. Just thinking of, we are several here over 30. There is a possibility that 30 of us might have different understandings of what you are really trying to communicate. So I'm just trying to look at syllabus as written and the syllabus as spoken. In other words, the role of influence in all these, whether it's phenomenological or any other, but even if it's experience, whose influence matters there. Just maybe you could comment on that.
Sure. I mean, I always read, and so for me, the mode of sort of the lecture is always in the sort of literary sense of a reading, and so I don't question that very often. But I did question having the visuals be text. And I don't know, I mean, I promise I'm not lying if you're willing to trust me, but my impulse was to actually use a Havlicka font and have a very non-serif presentation. And I accidentally clicked on that, to my mind, hideous and tiny bit, and realized that at the level of scale it was in the black and white contrast, I actually didn't use white. I used a little bit grayer color of white. That there was something about it that almost relaxed my eye and allowed me to not feel like I needed to read it. And Adi asked me, how long did it take me to choose the font? It took me a week and a half. I was importing fonts. I was buying fonts on sample and stuff. I obsess on these things. It's really embarrassing, actually. It's also a way I procrastinate. But at any rate, so Samson, to your question, I mean, my hope was that the visual presentation of that font, in some sense, detached the authority of my voice and even the authority of the text itself, and allowed it to be, in some sense, more self-objectifying, if that makes sense, to sort of objectify. And that's why I didn't want to be present in video. I wanted it to be voice, guitar, text, to really, in some sense, perform an act of what I consider to be the freely chosen objectification of the self by the subject, which I think is one of the most dangerous and most difficult and surely most risky moves we can take. But as long as I was taking it for myself, I felt okay with that. If you were to ask me about this in a pedagogical application, I'd probably run away. But nonetheless, I think it is provocative. And I know I've gone over time a bit, and so I'm sorry for that. But thank you so much, Rita.
Not really that because of your text. What I meant was even the teacher can distribute text, handouts, can give whatever.
Yes.
But students reading that, they have a different take on. But as the teacher, as the voice comes out, there is a direction and an understanding that is conveyed. That context was trying to frame. Not necessarily.
Okay, no, I do see your point there. Yeah, and again, it's no surprise to most of you who know me that like I'm very hesitant to dismiss out of hand the role of the teacher's voice, and in particular the pedagogical component of the lecture. I think has a place. I'm not a constructivist, and I think I showed as much in the presentation. But I do think there are a number of good questions from constructivists and from others who are less confident, perhaps, in the in that mode of address. And I think the syllabus, though, probably carries, at least my conceptualization of it, is a fairly classical and traditional voiced document, which fortunately in my reading of other syllabus, I've seen others that are far more that are different. And it's that difference that I'm more interested in than in my necessarily personal attachment to a certain way of communicating. But yeah. Anyhow, thank you all so much.
Well, let me take this opportunity to thank you, Sam. I wrote there very quickly, syllabus as performed or performance. I mean, as I was thinking about it, I kept thinking to myself, are you really playing while you're reading and moving the text? And then you confirmed for us, say that you, in fact, were doing all of those things. So,
yes, this was all live. This was all live. There wasn't anything pre-done there at all.
You are a pretty amazing individual who can manage all of those things. So the syllabus as performer, as performed, as performance, I think we could talk a long time about your presentation today. So thank you so very much. You've really given us something to think about, and not only think about, but to actually kind of think back on the poetics and the movement and the resonance of it. So thank you so much. So on behalf of the department, thank you for coming and giving your presentation today. It will be a recording. I believe it's on the department website for anyone who maybe missed part of it, or if you want to tell somebody about it. Thanks everyone for coming today. We can give them all a clap up there.
Thank you so much.
Yes, and thank you everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you at another webinar, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. Okay. Wonderful. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay. Bye-bye.